everyone! Today I'll be showing how I created my 18th century stays for my Outlander project. The main fabrics I used for this project were first a white linen that I bought online that is a heavyweight. It's the heaviest weight that they sold before they listed it as a canvas. This was about $11 a yard, and this will act as the two layers that surround the bones, so it needs to be a sturdier fabric, which is why I went for the heavy. And for the fashion fabric that's going to be on the front of the stays, I ended up finding this actually at a thrift store. I think it's about 6.5 yards, and from some helpful people on Instagram, I think I figured out that it is rayon, so not a historically accurate material, but I thought it was just so pretty, and I thought it would also be great for the stays. The pattern I'm using for this project is the Simplicity 8162 pattern by American Duchess. I redrafted the pattern I used to make the mock-up, but this time I added another inch, so this is 2.5 inches longer than the original pattern. And I also redrafted the boning pattern to be fully boned stays instead of half boned stays like originally. I did this with the help of a American Duchess YouTube video on how to redraft the boning channels. The next step was to cut out all of the pieces I needed. This is probably the most boring part of this video, and I'm not sure why I recorded so much footage. I've cut it down a lot. But it is important to remember that you need to cut out 2 layers of the interlining fabric, so that heavier fabric that's going to go around the bones, you need 2 identical layers, and then you need only 1 of the fashion fabric that sits on top, and these will make up the 3 layers of the main body of the stays. For this fabric, you might notice that one of my pattern pieces needs to be cut on the bias, and I have it flipped upside down, and I never fixed it. From now on in the project, the 3 layers that I just cut out are going to be treated as 1 layer. In order to achieve this, I pinned them together first, and then I just took a long piece of thread and I loosely basted the layers together. This is to keep them from moving around when sewing the boning channels, where pins would really get in the way of your very narrow boning channels. And this basting will stay in all the way until every boning channel has been sewed in. Once all the basting is complete, a very important step is to iron the layers together. This is to make sure that the fabric layers are flat and that nothing goes wonky while you're sewing the boning channels. The next step is to trace the boning channels that I created on the pattern pieces onto this is going to be the inside of the stays. I'm using a air dissolving pen, which says takes about an hour to dissolve, but in reality it's like a couple of days. And if you want it to dissolve faster, I think you can just use water. For this project, I ended up buying zip ties that were about 1/4 of an inch. I think they're a tiny bit less than 1/4 of an inch thick. So my boning channels were drawn at 3/8 of an inch using a clear ruler. And the other thing I'm marking out is the seam allowances on all of the vertical edges, which for this pattern are 5/8 inches. So from each edge you start with the 5/8 measurement, and I'm drawing a dashed line here to remind myself that that is going to be a seam. But I still just am going to sew a straight line on it, so it doesn't really matter, but that's just what I ended up doing. And here I'm drawing the seam line because this is one of the front pieces, and on the front piece of the stays, the boning does not go all the way to the top. And that's a very key thing to remember, because when I was making my mock-ups, I forgot to draw this line and I was making the boning go way too far before I caught myself. This is one of the inner pieces that it's not the front or the back, and the process is basically the same. You just make sure you mark out your seam allowance, and do not forget the tab, because the tab changes a lot about how you draw your boning pattern, because the bones have to go all the way to the end of the tab. They can't stop in the middle because you won't have a way to insert them later. Now it's time to sew the boning channels. You might notice that the one I am currently sewing has not been ironed. This was something I realized too late, and I went back after doing the first couple, I think, and realized how important ironing was, and I fixed that mistake. Something to remember when sewing the boning channels is that the thread is going to show on the front of your stays, and because of this you want to make sure you have matching thread, or fashionably contrasting, I guess, but in this case I went with matching pink cotton thread for the bobbin, and that is because the stays are flipped upside down and I'm sewing the traced lines from the back. So my main thread is white and then the bottom thread is pink. A tip I picked up from some other videos I watched is that to help with the warping of the fabric, you should only sew from one direction. So for every piece I sew, I always start at the top and sew to the bottom, stop my sewing, and move to the next line of sewing. On each line, I'm also backstitching the beginning to hold the thread in place. This is sort of creating a knot. In hindsight, that kind of made some ugly, bulky threads on the front of my stays, but I think only I would notice that, and no one's gonna see these anyway, but I do want them to be pretty for myself. Next, I'm going to flip the edge seams of all 4 pieces, so the 2 front and the 2 back, over the seam allowance amount, and iron that in pretty good from both sides. Now that the boning channels are in, I can rip out all of that basting thread. So I basically just trimmed it at a spot and pulled it all the way out. I also ended up trimming around all the loose threads hanging out from everywhere to clean it up a bit before moving on. This is some stays pieces and various amounts of done. Some have boning, some don't, but they all have the boning channels sewed in, so I wanted to insert that here. For the boning for this project, I again went with American Duchess's recommendation and chose zip ties. The ones I used mainly for this project are the ones I'm picking up now. I got these off of Amazon and there are 50 per package and they are 18 inches long. I also substituted some of those shorter ones that I showed first. These ones are pretty flexible and they are about 1/4 of an inch thick. For each boning piece, I measured how long it should be and used a nail cutter to cut them to size. I chose this because I didn't have a file on hand that could file through plastic, and the important thing is that you don't want any sharp points that could end up poking through your binding later and make you have to repair your stays. These zip ties came to me folded in half, so they do have a slight bend to them. In order to compensate for that, you just have to flip one direction and then the next direction when you're inserting the bones, and this will cancel out the bend in each one and make them lay perfectly flat, which is great. I experimented here using a lighter to smooth out the edges. I didn't think it was necessary. The nail cutter did a really good job making them smooth. But another thing to note is that when a boning channel intersects another boning channel, it makes a sort of diagonal line on the end. And you could just cut these round, but it kind of shows through to the front, I noticed. So instead, I actually cut the bone to a matching diagonal and just rounds it off the very point. Sorry for interrupting this lovely music, but I just have to be proud of myself that I made it through this whole segment without making a joke about boning. What I'm doing here, I'm not sure is actually necessary, but to me it just seems like another line of defense to keep the bones inside the stays. So I sewed along the edge of each of the boning channels in order to close them off. And I had to be very careful to make sure that the bones were out of the way because I did not want my needle to hit any of those thick pieces of plastic. You can see here that I accidentally sewed off of the top fashion fabric and I had to redo it at a line that was going to go across all 3 pieces of fabric at once. Of course, while doing this, I did find some bones that I had cut too long, so I had to make constant little adjustments here and there while closing off these boning channels. I know I technically don't need to do anything to these raw edges that are going to be in the inside of the stays because I'm going to line them, but I felt like I needed to do something. I do have pinking shears, but they are antique and I had never tried to use them, and they're pretty dull, and I have no idea how to sharpen pinking shears. So I had to experiment with my machine, which was kind of terrifying, to be real. I don't know much about my machine. I've pretty much only just used the 1 foot and sewed in a straight line. So I had to pull out that manual and figure out how to do a sort of zigzag stitch along the end in order to keep them from fraying. The foot I used, I think it's called a zigzag stitch. So I had to make sure I had that foot, which I did, thank goodness, and change it out for the one I was using. It looks like this. I don't know. I don't have a very good spot where you can see it. It has kind of an opening on one end where the thread collects, and when you pull the thread off, you have to go in one direction. And then I had to figure out how to change from a straight stitch to the zigzag stitch, which I believe is the number 5. You have to make sure your needle's all the way up, and then you twist that big knob until the red dot goes down to 5. And it was as simple as that. I really did not trust that I had done it right, so I did a lot of tests to make sure the tension was still right and it was working like it was supposed to. I ran this overcasting stitch down the edges of all of the pieces that would be raw on the inside of the stays. And this was very nerve-wracking, and it was sewing through a pretty thick fabric, and I had to keep it very close on the edge because I think the last part of the zigzag is supposed to go off of the edge of the material and then back onto it, and that's kind of what kind of seals, I guess, all the layers together. And this is all of the pieces finished. The next steps are going to be putting them together and creating the stays, but that is going to be the next video because this took me a lot of time and a lot of days, and I have a lot of footage, so this video would be way too long. So stay tuned for part 2 where I am going to finish the stays.